All right, Psalm 14 is where we are. Psalm 14. There was a gesture one time, jester, Jester. There was a gesture one time that had been acting as he was supposed to, acting somewhat silly. And the king called him the most silly of individuals, and he gave him a scepter. And he told him, he said, "You keep this scepter, and when you find someone that is more foolish than you give it to them." And so the jester kept the scepter for quite a while. One day, he was called in, the jester was called into the king's court, and he was ready to perform. But when he was called in, he realized that the king was deathly ill. And so he went up to the king and he talked to the king. And as he talked to the king, he said, "King, you need to pray to your God." The king said, "I have no God." He said, "Well, you need to deal with him because you're fixing to go to eternity. Have you prepared?" And the king said, "No, I have not prepared. I do not know anything of an eternity." And the jester gave the king his scepter, and he said, "I have found one more foolish than I." Well, you think about that, and you look at this psalm, and you see the reason for the story. Psalm 14 is a very short psalm. That the title that my translation gave it is "The Folly of Godless and God's Final Triumph." As we said last week, as we introduced it, it's identical in many ways to Psalm 53. It's a psalm. It's called the Psalm of David. Could be translated a psalm by David, a psalm of David, or even a psalm to David. And so we generally give David the credit for being the author of this psalm. But he talks about really the foolish and the rebellious. And he begins in verse 1. He says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none who does good." Now, I want us to think two or three different lines of thought, and I'll try to make sure you're with me on the lines of thought as we go through this psalm. But some that I've always thought of, and some that as I was studying other individuals today on this psalm, I found some of the things that they said kind of fascinating and interesting. And matter of fact, Jerry Barber stopped by the building just for a few minutes this morning, and I said, "Have you ever heard this?" And he said, "No." So we've got a consensus there that we talked about it for a little while. So I'll bring some of that up as well in this psalm. But notice that he begins, "The fool." We think of the fool, we think of an individual that is empty-headed, the individual that is foolish, the individual that acts foolish, the individual that hasn't given thought. And notice what he says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Brother Eddie Clower, in his commentary on this, and like I say, this is one of those that I'd never heard before. Brother McClure or Clower said that he said he believed that what the psalmist was saying here was that the individual that does not or claims that there is no God, says there is no God, he's a fool. But his foolishness began not because of the evidence that was presented to him. But notice where it started. It said it started in his heart. Well, I don't exactly read that way. I mean, it reads as he said he's talking within himself. Brother Clover talked about how that this foolish man did not see the evidence. Well, now think about that for a minute. We sit back a lot of times and we think that as we hear, like on TV and in movies and read in articles, that there really is no evidence for Christianity. But that's part of modern day thinking that wants you to believe that that's so. There is no evidence. But the reality is that there's overwhelming evidence. Only, Hebrews chapter 3 talks about every house that's built has a builder. Okay, that makes sense, doesn't it? Now, when you look at the human body and you look at how it's made and how it works together, it's got to have a creator. The odds of it coming together into one body and then replicating itself are so astronomical that we can't really even fathom the odds. But then when we put it with the fact that God created, we say, okay, makes sense. It's sort of like, I bet there's another guy, Jay probably remembers, Neil Thomas Pryor. You remember him? He was vice president at Harding. And I have to call him Neil Thomas Pryor because Neil Thomas Pryor is the son that was at Harding as vice president. His father was Neil Pryor. And the reason I know this is because I preached where Pryor's mama and sister went when I was in West Kentucky. That's where they went. And Sister Pryor made the distinction between her husband, who had passed away by the time I got there, and her son. And so when Brother Pryor made an appearance in our area for a gospel meeting, we had to announce him as Neil Thomas Pryor. And so it got confusing at times. But I noticed that Neil Thomas Pryor later on in life went by Neil Pryor. So, but anyway, Brother Neil wrote a book on you can trust your Bible, and he used the imagery of Robinson Crusoe, that story there. But basically, and at the end of every chapter, he came back to it and he said, "There's another stone. There's another stone," and he was talking about the Bible. But the same could be said true with the body or this world. We look at the design. We look at the fact that we have a marvelous design, not only the human body, but the world itself and how it all works together. You can look at the other arguments, the teleological, that's the cosmological, and you look at the teleological, the ontological, moral arguments. We can find evidence for God. But the fool, he said, without evidence, without any conviction, just there's no God. We look and we often point to the idea of atheism. Atheism is the belief that there is no God. Agnostic is the idea of there's probably not a God. Theism, as we would call it, is what we believe, that there is a God. The atheist denies flat out the existence of God. He says, or she says, that there is no God, and there's thus no reason for organized religion, if you will. This individual, though, in Psalm 14, claims sort of an independence from God. There's no God. I just believe there's no God. That's what he says. But now, I got to think about this here 2-3 weeks ago. And I was thinking about the fact that there are a lot of folks that are not atheist, don't claim to be atheist, but live a very similar life to the atheist. Now, here's where I'm coming from. They'll tell you they believe in God. They may even go as far as to tell you, I pray. But they don't live their life in accordance to the will of God, nor are they willing to read it to find out what it says. And thus, in many ways, they become, if you will, a practical atheist. Now, by strict definition, that's not what a practical atheist is. But by fudging the definition a little bit, that's what they become. And so we have to be very careful that when we look for the individual that says, well, there is no God. Oh, that's an atheist. Well, there's a lot of folks living like there's no God, and that he hasn't revealed anything to them. But the psalmist here is not so concerned about the atheist, just as the idea is that there's individual has made this decision within his heart. There's no God. And so, having made that statement, and look at the rest of the psalm, if you will, from that statement. There are several things that such a belief affect. If you'll notice the last part of this verse, they are corrupt, they have done abominable works, there is none who does good. The individual that says there is no God or lives like there is no God will often have a character problem. The psalmist says here they're corrupt. The word corrupt there has the idea, the Hebrew word has the idea of soured milk, rancid milk. He says they've done abominable works. They've taken the wrong road. The things that they're doing are not what God would have them to do. And then he goes on and classifies, and he just says there's none that's good. There's nothing that they're doing that's good. And so their character is affected. Well, then he goes on and he says in verses 2 and 3, he says, not only is their character not good, but he says their conduct is not good. Well, let's look at what he says. He says, the Lord looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. The Lord looks down. Now, think about that. The Lord sees them. Imagine, if you will, that you're living in David's day. We're assuming, of course, David wrote this. But you're living in David's day. And as you're living in David's day, you hear this psalm read. Whether your faith or your convictions are on the fence, or whether they are completely surrendered to God, or whether they're not. But you're listening to this psalm and you say, okay, my character's affected. But God sees that. That might change the way I look at things. Because God sees what's going on in my life. And notice, though, he says in the second line of verse 2, to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. God looks, God sees, to see if there are any that are following him. Now, it's interesting because what did he say at the last part of verse 1? There's none good. Sort of reminds us of what Paul said in Romans chapter 3. But nevertheless, look now at verse 3. They have all turned aside. There's three things, matter of fact, here. They've all turned aside. They've turned away to their own pleasures. They have together become corrupt. They've turned to evil. There is none who does good. He repeats that refrain again. No, not one. They live a deprived life. Their conduct is such that they live a deprived life. Now, this makes sense, doesn't it? Why? Because they have no standard. They have no standard. After a while, when we leave, I've got to go get Suzanne some gas. Because as we were walking out of the house, she said, which car do you want to go in? I said, let's go in yours. She says, it has no gas. I said, that's the one we need to go in. We need to go get you some gas. When we get gas here in a few minutes, we will put the nozzle in, or I will put the nozzle in the car, and it will roll out, and I'll pay based upon the idea of how many gallons I get, how many gallons put into that car. And of course, then the Bureau of Weights and Measures, of course, checks are supposed to check those pumps every so often to make sure that they're pumping out a gallon of gas for what they say. There's a standard there. If we were to come in here and want to know how long these pews are, we measure them. We bring out a ruler of some kind, a measuring device. We have a standard. We understand that 12 inches equal a foot, and so forth and so on, 3 feet a yard, and things of that nature. We have a standard. The atheist has to find a standard. His standard is not the Bible, which is kind of interesting because when you stop and think about it, when you listen to some of these people talk and you read some of their writings, and they'll talk about atheists and saying this is right and this is wrong and this is right and this is wrong, and you ask, where did you get your morals? Where did they come from? Reality is they have no answer for that question. Well, why does the atheist believe that it's wrong to kill? Why does the atheist believe that it's wrong to disobey the laws of the land? You see the problem the atheist has. But because then they have no overall standard, then their conduct is different. And the psalmist deals with that. They've turned aside, they've become corrupt, and they're not good. Then he says in verse 4, the psalmist says, have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge? In other words, do they understand what they're doing? You might imply this question, do they know what they're doing? Do they understand? But not only do they understand, but do they understand how they affect others? Go on, see what he says. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call on the Lord? They're devouring the righteous. They're not doing what they're supposed to with regards to people. The idea of eating up my people as they eat bread, they are taking advantage of the poor. They're being unkind, unsympathetic. They're acting in such a way as to be contrary to God's own people. And he goes on to say, they do not call on the Lord. So if you think about it, verse 1 says, the individual that says there is no God has a character issue. And then he says in verses 2 and 3, he has a conduct issue. And then in verse 4, he says he has a compassion issue. There, they are in great fear, for God is in the generation, or God is with the generation of the righteous. You shame the counsel of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. And so they look at the poor, and they have great disdain for the poor. They don't treat them fairly. They don't treat them rightly. And notice what he says. He says, you shame the counsel of the poor. But for them, God's a stronghold. You shame the poor. You do what you can to affect their faith. Now, go back to that idea at the very first part of verse 4. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge? Do they not understand what they're doing to themselves? And do they not understand what they're doing to others? That's what the psalmist is asking. Oh, verse 7, that the salvation of Israel come out of Zion when the Lord brings back the captivity of his people. Let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. And so he calls upon a deliverance of God, or deliverance not from God, but a deliverance of God or by God. They want to be vindicated. Vindication is really what we all want. We want to be shown right. And that doesn't mean we have to sit down in an argument with people and argue the facts. Are to be vindicated. To be vindicated, ultimately, the Christian really, if you go through the Bible, that's all folks really want. You go back to the book of Job, that's all Job wanted, was to be vindicated. You go through the writings of Paul, you go through the writings of John in Revelation, they want vindication. Shown that we're right. Ultimate vindication is going to happen for us Christians on the day of judgment. And so while we may not be able to sit and make every argument clear and vindicate or prove and show that we are right, in the end we will be found right. Well, the psalmist here is calling for that vindication, and he talks about when the Lord will bring the captivity or brings back the captivity of his people. Now we don't know when he's talking about. Is this prophetic? In other words, later after David lives, you have Assyria come in and take away the children of Israel. And then you have later after that, you have Babylon coming in and taking away the children of Israel. And so is he talking about a time in which they're going to come back? Say the books of Ezra and Nehemiah would be a good example. We just don't know. He doesn't say. Was he thinking about a general time? Not necessarily was he trying to predict a specific time with regards to Assyria or Babylon. Was he thinking about a general time, or was he thinking about the ultimate judgment? We don't know. He just says, when the Lord brings back the captivity of his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. He's using Jacob and Israel idea with the idea of God's people. Let God's people rejoice. Let God's people be glad. That here's the answer, verse 7. The fool says there's no God, and so consequently his conduct, his character, it affects his compassion, it affects people, affects those around him. One day, he'll get his. Something somebody like to add, say. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The problem is that natural law is not equal and the same for everybody. So what I believe is natural law, this fellow over here believes is natural law, but the two sometimes butt heads. So yes, that is true. They do some claim. It's a good point. It's a good question. But you still don't have a universal. I think what I'm trying to say is you don't have a universal clear cut standard there. And that becomes the ultimate problem for them even. Yeah. Right. Which is interesting because here's the answer to that. Then that makes you a god. What is? No. It does because you got a tremendous difference between capital G God and little G God, and so a God is just that. But if you but listen, but what did he say? What did he just say? I know. I know. That's what she said. I know. So when you say I know that I'm doing what's right. Natural law is more defined by biology, really. But she says she knows, and so when anybody says they know, it's sort of like Steve. It's sort of like the humanist. It's sort of like the Gnostics of First John and the humanists of today. They say I know. When they say I know, they've made themselves a god from the standpoint of not one to be worshipped, but one that has all knowledge. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Could be. So if you narrow it down to saying the word fool here means a person that's
morally deficient, it does make this all make more sense.
Sure.
Because what this describes is a person who's morally deficient, because I guess the only thing I do know, I have one really good friend who's absolutely an atheist, raised in the Church of Christ, and then in the Baptist church. And then two more people that I was really close to in my life who were absolutely atheists. And they weren't like this described at all. Matter of fact, they were probably, those three people were probably as quote moral as anybody that I knew. You know, they just flat don't believe that.
Well, what they've taken is they've taken the moral aspect probably of the Bible, and they've said this is the way we want to live our life, but we don't believe that there's a God that's over for whatever reason. And there's a lot of different reasons why people make that distinction, but that's what they've done.
So, who grew up in the United States, who could believe that their beliefs aren't affected by Judeo-Christian teachings, that it would be impossible, because, you know, I mean, we had laws, first, in the country of England had laws. They were different than our laws, but they weren't actually different. I mean, it wasn't like it was okay to murder somebody. I mean, that goes all the way to Moses, right? And then the Ten Commandments. So it's really not possible to divorce yourself from those teachings and decide what you think is moral and not moral, because you could, even if you didn't believe in God for 1 second, you couldn't divorce yourself from the society that is kind of founded on these general beliefs. Of course, we've gone way past just what's in the Bible, but because there's lots of things that we believe that are sins, that's certainly not illegal, right?
Right.
Adultery is not illegal.
Right.
Not anymore.
No.
Sodomy is not illegal.
Right.
Sin and violence is not illegal. It was for a long time. But it's not possible to divorce yourself from that or separate yourself from that. Like my one friend, raised in the Church of Christ and then raised his kids kind of in the Baptist church. Good pastor. He reads Stephen Hawking. He's read all the books. He's as moral as anybody I read.
Right.
He's an absolute moral person.
Right.
He doesn't believe.
Right.
He just doesn't believe. And then he will say to me, you seem pretty smart. Well, why do you still believe this? And so I'll explain it to him. And I talk to him 2 or 3 times a week. He's a great guy.
Yeah.
He just, and when I say he's moral, he really is moral. But I do remind him, Don, it's impossible for you to believe things are right or wrong. You got to know it's not based on what you read with Stephen Hawking or some of these other people that just read. I said, that's stuff you learned growing up with your mama. She's the one taught you this, and she taught you this because she learned it at church, and her mom and dad taught her.
Yeah.
And so I like to ask him, what do you think it's going to take, if we go down your road, what is going to take the place of the church and the Bible if the whole world eventually decides this is hogwash and we don't believe? What is going to take the place? Where are we going to get our moral direction? I said, because it's going to be hard to do this. Leave people say, well, it says in the Bible you shouldn't murder. 10 Commandments. If we can't do nothing else, let's do the 10 Commandments, but 8 of which are still valid, I guess, right?
Well, all of them except remember the Sabbath, and then, all of them except remember the Sabbath, but then you have worship upon the first day of the week in the New Testament. So in essence, even that one is. Yeah.
I love music.
Yeah. No. No. But
he doesn't have, I'm not trying to hang him up.
No. No.
My belief vindicated with him. We just talk about it. And
but here's the ultimate problem that I have with that is therefore he believes those things to be right and wrong. But why should he be right and why can't I be the exact opposite? In other words, what he says is right, I say is wrong. But what I say is based upon what God says. In other words, every atheist has a sense of what's right and wrong. They have a sense of what they will do and what they won't do. But they vary. There's no absolute standard for them. And so, but for the Christian, there is. It's called Bible. Yeah. But who defined that legality as being right or wrong? And what basis did you define that as being right or wrong? But where did it come from? But so then an atheist doesn't have a ruler. He has his own ruler from standpoint, I'm talking about measurement now. He has his own ruler. But the next atheist behind him also has a ruler. But his ruler may be 6 inches short or 3 inches short. Whereas the Christian doesn't have to worry about that. That's all he has right there.
What would happen much like what happened. Legislative bodies would decide what's right and what's wrong.
So who made them God?
You didn't want to be elected.
No, I didn't. I elected them for some other purpose. I elected them for some other purpose. But see, to me, this is where our society right now has fallen, is that we are leaving the Bible and we're making government the absolute rule to do everything for us. And that's not what government was set up for. But at the same time too, no, I know you're not. No, yeah, exactly. No, right. But how many laws, and boy, there's a lot, how many laws are on the books that tell us things that really they shouldn't? In other words, they're determining right and wrong. The law of abortion right now, it would be a prime example. That's not what, the way I understand the Constitution of the United States, that's not what our government was set up for. Thank you. That's right. That's right. Right. So there are laws, as far when they come into my house to tell me things that I can and cannot do in my house. That's not what government was set up for. Sure. Well, see, I argue from a standpoint of this says don't do it. No, we're not. That's right. Well, we could if we can get our society back to doing what it's supposed to be doing. Well, yeah, they've taken it to an extreme, but they believe in some hard laws. Yeah, they don't mind. They don't mind. I told somebody this the other day. I can't remember who the dude is now, but I talked to a dude. This has been quite a few years ago. He was in the military, and he was over in Saudi Arabia, and he saw a crowd, and he just walked up on him. By the time he walked up, he said a head rolled down at his feet as he was at a beheading by the government. So yeah, they're a little different than us. Yeah.
This does make, and I'm not saying that I have no idea here, but
well, it
places that says the person deficient, spiritually deficient, or another way to look at this
is one way of looking at fool. The word fool, the Hebrew word can mean that. It can mean the idea of empty-headed. Go back to the book of Proverbs. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so one of the things I made mention of, I think the week you were gone, is Hebrew is a whole lot harder than Greek. Hebrew can mean several different things, whereas Greek is not. I'm not saying Greek is just, but it is more precise than Hebrew, and it presents a problem sometimes in understanding. Yeah, the let's see, which one is it? Um, oh yeah, like look at Psalm 16. And you'll see in that superscription, you'll see it called a Miktam of David. We have no idea what Miktam means. It actually, yeah, they're, but it can mean gold. There's a lot of things. It could be a pause. It could be some sort of like musical. We don't know. We have no clue. Yeah. Yep. 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 That's exactly right. Yeah. Exactly right. Exactly right. Oh yeah.
Well, we just took a quiz over at the page about phrases that people use that Jimmy thing, people that
Yeah.
use that like Catherine thing.
Oh yeah.
And Jimmy and I are like from the same pretty much generation, right? Not that much different.
Pat him on the back, Jimmy. It's generations. Sure. Yeah. 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 I don't know. Brings them back. Yeah.
So dedicated our beliefs and argue our standpoint from.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Talk to them and so your Bible said, man who lives like he's under a law, but really has no law, he's a law to himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, that's where their law comes from.
Right. Yes. But it's yeah. Yeah.
You took 100 cows that we survived. 10-year-old, raised them in a like in an orphanage, somebody taught them and set them out on an island. They're not gonna figure much out on their own, right?
No.
16, lost it over 16 like cars, and you put them on an island, 1,000 of them, men and women, so they could survive and reproduce. They would struggle to come up with what is right and wrong, completely on their own, devoid of any kind of raising or education.
Now I'll give you a class. Tarzan, I give you a classic example. I was talking to my son last night, and he had a little plumbing issue over the weekend. What turned out to be some roots in his line going out, and oh yeah, and sitting the line sitting by a big old pin oak tree, and so but anyway he said the plumber he called a guy that works for Freed Hardeman but does some plumbing on the side. He called him to come over there, and he did because he'd been over there before. And the guy looked at him and he said, Ethan said, he asked me where my, he said, I said, well, it sounds like, first of all, it might have been your air vent, your vents. And he said, well, it wasn't those. He said, then he asked me, where was he said, and he thought for a minute and he said, I said, you're clean out? And he said, yeah. He said, I told him I had no clue. I said, no, you have no clue, do you? What it is. So you can be raised. What happens is we're all, yeah, yeah, yes, that's the point. Yeah, because I knew what it was. I mean, always had one, used them, and so forth and so on. But here's the thing: we are all affected by what we read, what we see, and what we hear. We may not think we are, but we are. And that's what was happening here. And that happens all the time from the very beginning. Would I read them? No, no, because I wouldn't understand it. I mean, I've read, Well, see, I've had to through the years. In order to understand all this, that I don't understand, I've had to read a lot of this. Here's the point. Here's a couple of lessons that we can learn. First of all, rebellion has its results. And second of all, the Lord sees. The Lord sees all of men's actions and knows. And yes, there will be a time in which the Lord will bring them back. When, we don't know. I'm like Jim. I do think he was probably talking more about his own people than the prophecies with regards to Assyria and Babylon. But we just don't know if we're to say this is what he was talking about. Along this line, I read an article today. I thought it was interesting. I wanted just to bring it to your attention. There's a young lady, young by 30-ish, maybe 40-ish. She's an evangelical. She is claiming now that the reason we don't have, or the reason that women have been limited in actions in the church is not because of the Bible, but it's because of the translators of the Bible. And we, according to her, even had female apostles in the early church. And because the translators translated some of the, according to her, some of the names, the translators translated some of the male or female names male, that they were trying to exclude the women. And thus, if translators had been fair and right and done what they were supposed to do, according to her, we would have female leadership in the church. There's a real problem with that, and it's called she ain't got a leg to stand on because there's no evidence to what she's saying. But she's got a huge following, and there'll be more. And it gets back to that idea. What you hear affects you. So don't let folks, if folks give you a reason, ask them where they got it. That's the point, and that's really the point from this Psalm 14. All right, well, next week we'll get into Psalm 15. We'll talk about the man of God, the man that God approves in Psalm 15, and probably, hopefully, we can get through 16, the Miktam there in 16, because 17 is somewhat lengthy, and I'd like to at least finish that. Well, that gives us two more, Wednesdays. So, there's 4 Wednesdays in April, and then we'll start something else in May. Anything else? No, it's different. Yeah, it's the idea of when Christ talks about calling no one a fool, he's talking about from the standpoint of degrading them to the point of being right. Right. Yes. Yeah, it gets a lot of that's the idea of swearing and what you're going to set as your standard. Yeah, hatred. Yeah. Yeah, the word foolish means vain one. Can mean empty, but vain person. Anything else? Yeah. Okay. No, I'm sorry. I kept interrupting you. I wanted to quit interrupting you. No, I just like I say, I felt like I kept talking and interrupting you. I'm sorry. Yeah. Right. Let's bow for word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, thankful for the blessing of it, for the opportunity to study your word and for what it means to us and to our lives. We appreciate the fact that you've given it to mankind, and we ask that you be with us, that we may share it with others, that we may share your revelation, your word with others, that they'll see you and that they will see the salvation that you offer and that they'll follow you. We ask that you be with us as we go throughout the rest of this week, that we'll be the shining example that we need to be. We ask that you watch over us, that you bless us and keep us and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen.